Welcome to the Jones Zone, a podcast by Darryl and JJ Jones.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Jones Zone. Today, we've got a great guest, a commercial real estate agent, Mr. Michael Collins. He's the vice chairman of Dom Commercial, a 100-year-old brokerage firm headquartered in downtown Los Angeles. Michael has been selling and leasing multi-million-dollar properties for decades. He primarily specializes in larger industrial properties with an emphasis on investment sales. He is located in Costa Mesa, California, where he heads the investment division for Dom Commercial. Welcome, Michael Collins. Thank you so much for joining us on the Jones Zone.
Good morning, Darryl. Nice to see you.
Great to see you. So, let's go ahead and just dive right in. Give us an overview of the current state of it. How is the commercial real estate market at the moment? At the end of 2024, here we are.
Well, the commercial real estate market is a bit diverse. It's not just one segment. There's industrial properties, office properties, retail properties, and sometimes they put multifamily apartments into that mix as well, or it's put into the residential side, which is your expertise. The market has been hurting over the last couple of years because of high interest rates. There's positive movement toward recovery. The industrial market is probably the strongest of the commercial markets. The office market, likely the weakest. During COVID, we learned you can work from your home. A lot of people let their leases lapse in office space or downsize because their employees wanted to work from home and the employers allowed that. So the demand for office has declined. Again, interest rates have hurt the need to build up warehouse product because of less consumption by consumers. But in the last 6-9 months, there's been more positive absorption, more space being leased than coming to market in the industrial sector. Just to give you kind of a balance of what those three primary commercial markets are like, at the best of times in the late 2019, 2020, industrial vacancy was around 2%. Very, very low. Today, it's around 5.5%. Not bad, but another way to look at it, the vacancy is more than double, nearly triple what it was. So a lot of people were subleasing space. Big distribution companies were putting maybe half of their large warehouse on the market for sublease because they didn't have as high a demand from their customers to fill those warehouses. Let's just take an example. Nordstrom, high-end retailer. If they have less sales, then they have less need to warehouse product as the market softened due to high interest rates, which impacts everybody, individuals and companies. So people that might have been public warehousers with, say, 300,000 foot warehouse, of which 100,000 feet was occupied by their client, Nordstrom. Maybe Nordstrom says, we don't need that space anymore. So they let their lease, usually with public warehouses, short-term duration commitments, they let that lapse. And now that public warehouser may put that 100,000 square feet on the market. So if that's done over and over by dozens of warehousers, then you saw a lot of product coming on the market. In the meantime, there's space getting leased by new people coming into the market. But during the downtrend of, say, 22, 23, there was more space coming on the market than being leased. That's called negative absorption. That negative absorption raised vacancy. And from, let's say, 2020 to today, that's why you had 2% vacancy rising to 5.5%. I'll just close so I'm not too technical on that. In recent quarters, there's been modest positive absorption of industrial space.
I think it would be important to even note, because when you're talking about these numbers, 100,000 square feet, that's over 2 acres of space. So
Yes.
that, I think it would be interesting for the listeners to realize that. So we're talking about some big buildings.
Yes. Darryl, I just kind of gave you quite a bit of input on the industrial side, 5.5% vacancy. Compare that to Southern California office vacancy. It's reported to be around 17.5%. So it's more than triple the vacancy of industrial. And retail vacancy, believe it or not, is not as high as maybe the general public would think. With the downturn of consumer spending due to high interest rates, the vacancy in retail is pretty close to industrial, if not slightly less. So let's say in the 4.5% range. So the segment of commercial real estate that's hurting is office.
That makes sense. Do you see any remedy for that? Meaning, because for example, I heard that there was a mall that was reorganizing things. They're doing a lot of live workspace. Do you see any of that going on currently in Orange County? Much of that at all?
Yes, there has been attempts to fill vacancy through a variety of means. One is maybe to change the use mix a bit. And instead of having a pure office building, maybe you try to attract retail tenants, certainly on the ground floor. And I'm even seeing a retail use like a gym, a 24-hour fitness type, go into office buildings as the landlord is trying to recapture occupancy lost to the typical law firm, CPA, company like yours, residential realtor, or mine, commercial realtor. As I'm sitting here speaking with you, I'm in a high-rise office building in Costa Mesa, one of the nicest, owned by the Sagerstrom family, and we lease the ground floor space in their building. Since I've been in this particular building for a few years, I've seen law firms shrink, other users shrink their space. They may not vacate, but let's say a law firm occupied 2 or 3 floors. As their lease comes about, they might just say, we're not going to renew on all 3 floors. We're going to stay in 2. Again, negative absorption in this building, this is a very high class building. It might have been 95% occupancy, whereas today it's probably more in the low 80s.
Yeah, I actually recently saw someone put an escape room in an office, but you know what escape room is? I have kids.
Yes.
So yeah, I guess you've got to come get very creative now, I suppose.
Yes, there's one other that I'll mention that's very difficult to implement, but a lot of office owners, developers have thought about, or investors, an investor might buy an office building at a discount because of the challenging times and consider changing that high-rise office into apartments. But it's not as simple as the layman would think. Well, we just fill those office spaces, because there's a lot of code with regard to hallways and exits, and it's more stringent when it comes to residential than it is to pure office. The change is capital intensive. But that's another avenue that will, let's say, mitigate the high vacancy. Lastly, the number one thing that will cause absorption to go up is compelling lease rates. If you think about it, if you lowered the cost to the tenant lower and lower, at some point it's going to drive demand.
What factors should someone consider when deciding to invest in commercial real estate, Michael?
Well, again, there's these various types. All these retail strip centers you see, or big single tenant users, again, like a Nordstrom or a Big Five, these buildings, this real estate is owned by investors, as are the large warehouse that you see along the freeways, big building leased to Rico or United Parcel Service. These buildings sometimes are owned by the occupant, what I call the user, but more often they're owned by investors. So there are investors that buy retail space, that buy office buildings, that buy industrial buildings. So I think, how would I guide somebody? The buyer for a big box industrial building, I think, is somebody that's looking for minimal management, often single tenant buildings, but higher risk. You lose that tenant, you've got an empty building that could be 100, 200, 300,000 square feet, 2, 4, 6 acres under roof. Whereas the retail strip center is more comforting to many investors, that I've got 8 tenants in my building, maybe all occupying similar size. If I lose one, I still have decent cash flow, maybe covering my mortgage plus, so I don't have as high of risk. But the big investors that buy industrial, they don't want that management. They don't want to deal with little tenants that are complaining about their air conditioning's out, etc. So how would I guide somebody? If I had an institution who generally knows what product type they want to buy and the geography they want to buy in, if I had an institution or a high net worth individual approach me, and let's just say by example, they said, I have $20 million of cash I want to invest, I would first ask them, what do they envision buying? Where do you want to buy it? What product type do you prefer to purchase? And usually they know. I want to buy apartments. I want to buy industrial. I just had somebody approach me that owned hundreds of apartment units that they've been selling off. And they said, I have heard over the years from my wealthy colleagues that industrial is the way to go. When you lose tenant A and you look for tenant B, there's not a lot of fixturizing like there is in office space, like there is in residential. It's a big box warehouse with typically a 10% component of office space. So then I asked them, do you envision buying a multi-tenant building with 5 or 6 tenants in it, or would you prefer single tenant? And then we'll talk about the pros and cons of that. So generally, I can learn what they want, and then I'll make my best suggestions for that product type. And then we'll talk about other elements of investing. If you bought an empty building, you can probably negotiate a better deal with the seller and then take the leasing risk to lease it up and end up with a higher cap rate versus buying something, let's call it tied in a bow, that's nice. Here's a building that's 200,000 feet. It's leased to Home Depot and there's 6 years to go on the lease and it's being offered at a 5% return versus buying the empty building, taking the risk, leasing it up, and you might end up with a 6% return. So there's a lot of variables to helping an investor find the right product to buy.
You mentioned Home Depot. Who is the largest, and you may or may not have this information with you, but who is the largest, let's say, industrial building owner in California? Is there such a stat?
Yes. There are what they call REITs, real estate investment trusts, that heavily invest. As an example, to answer your question, Prologis They're all across the United States, and their MO is to buy what they call big box industrial. Big box meaning 100,000 square feet, million square foot buildings. Prologis owns hundreds of these buildings across the country.
You had mentioned before we started the show too, that Home Depot, there are certain corporations, I found it very interesting, that prefer to own and then some that prefer to lease. Can you walk us through that and who they are?
Yes.
Just examples?
So it's, if you're talking about companies that generate hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue and have the capital to buy, there are some major corporations that prefer to take their retained earnings, their monies that they've accumulated over the years and purchase real estate because as intelligent business people, they see that real estate has appreciated over the years. And then there are others that prefer not to invest that heavy capital up front to buy, but keep it to expand, have more locations. So just to pick a couple of companies that I've dealt with, and you mentioned one, Home Depot. Home Depot tends to be a tenant. They have the capital to buy the real estate, but they tend to be a tenant paying rent, keep their capital, use it to replenish product, open more stores, and build. And in their minds, they're investing in what they do best, operating Home Depot. Now, another company that I sold a large property to, it was, as I recall, between 35 and 40 acres in Orange County, is United Parcel Service. They prefer to own their buildings. They don't own all of them, but where they can, they prefer to be an owner of the real estate. A third company I'll mention that's in the public's eye, Darryl, is Tesla. Their founder, owner, is the richest man in the world. Many of their properties, they're a tenant versus buying the real estate, which is kind of interesting. Now, I've never had a one-on-one discussion with Elon Musk, but I've dealt with his real estate director and his executives, and their requirement that I assisted with was to lease. And so again, it's a philosophy. When I work with them, just as a point of interest, they were very interested in locating in markets where the population in that market were high value homes, high earning people. The transaction that comes to mind that I made with them about 4 years ago was in Santa Monica. So they wanted the largest building they could find in that marketplace. And Santa Monica typically has smaller industrial buildings, 10, 15, 20,000 foot buildings. The building that they leased where I was involved was 85,000 square feet, one of the largest buildings in that city, largest industrial buildings, because there's so much product up there that's earmarked for residential. And in fact, when I was in the throes of leasing this building to Tesla, we were approached by a residential developer that tried to talk us out of making the lease with Tesla and selling them the land that they would pay top dollar from its current industrial use, because they knew by building high-rise residential on that industrial site that there would be economic benefit to them as the developer. But my client, a wealthy family, had no interest in raising capital. They were very happy to have Tesla as a long-term tenant.
I'm guessing that was somewhat a little risky to because they have to get it rezoned, et cetera. I'm guessing that these companies already have dealt with cities and know how to do that and felt confident enough that they could get it rezoned.
Yes.
That'd be fair to say.
Development is a challenging endeavor where you have to be patient and very sharp, but the rewards can be at the highest end of real estate. Because basically, you're buying at cost a piece of land, building buildings or a building at cost, and then you're offering it in the marketplace, and there's a margin that you calculate at the front end for what could I resell this development for, or what will I be able to lease it for at market rates, and what's my return? And that's where the highest returns are versus buying an existing building and then leasing it. Easier calculation, more demand to buy that product. So those returns in commercial real estate are typically around 5%. In the best of times, they were for prime industrial buildings around 4%. And if you had a Home Depot in a newer building, you could sell that building at 3.75%. But that was at a time when interest rates were around 3%. Now they're around 7%. So the yields that these investors expect have climbed to capture their interest to in the neighborhood of 5%. And I know out of state, 6-7%.
Interesting. Yeah, Tesla bought a movie theater in Anaheim Hills, and they've gutted it and threw out, I don't know the size of that movie theater, and I think it's now open.
That's a Tesla dealership.
Yeah. So it's interesting. So it's funny, you had mentioned too, to get back over to industrial building. I think this is something that I was somewhat naive to, because not doing commercial real estate, was there are other qualities in a building, such as just height of the ceiling and docks and parking and turning radius and things. Could you delve into that a little bit?
Sure. Now this affects a user who may be leasing an industrial building, who's looking for functionality for his company. And it also affects an astute investor. And if the investor isn't necessarily astute, hopefully his broker, like me, will point things out to him and look for things that he's not even thinking about. Often the investor that's wealthy, that's not highly sophisticated, looks at how much is the price and what's my return. Where to me, if I'm looking out for my investor client, I'm looking at functionality, and if we lose the tenant that's in the building, what can I release this for, and how leasable is this building? So some of the characteristics of a building that you would look at without getting too detailed are, if it's an industrial building, many of the Southern California users are warehousers, because we have the ports and they bring in product from the east, and then they put the product in these industrial buildings and then distribute them from there to their customer. So ceiling height, as you briefly mentioned, is important. Some industrial buildings have 12-foot ceilings. Some have 32-foot ceilings. The norm is around 24 feet. So ceiling height would be one ingredient I would look at. Others would be number of dock doors at a particular building. Obviously, bigger buildings have more doors, but kind of a general ratio would be one dock high door for every 10,000 feet. If you have less than that, it's below norm. If you had well above that, then that would be exceptional. Sometimes you'll see a building with a lot of truck doors, but the yard with that building constrains the ability to load a 53-foot semi-truck, the largest length of truck. Because that 53-foot truck with the cab, let's say you're getting to 60, 65 feet in total, if you could imagine a yard that was from the dock to the fence line, the property line, 75 feet, you couldn't even get that size of truck in there. So that building then has to lease to people that utilize smaller trucks, like say a catering company, catering trucks. So if you're an investor buying a building that had a lot of docks, but a constrained truck court in that yard, you're eliminating the users you could put in that building. So somebody like a Prologis, very sophisticated, they are either buying buildings that have truck courts that are 150 feet or larger that will accommodate any size of truck and multiple trucks coming in and out of it at the time. So it has what they call good ingress and egress. Some of these industrial buildings that an Amazon has been leasing are 1 million, 2 million square feet that you primarily find out in the Inland Empire, the Ontario, Greater Ontario marketplace. But they exist and they have been built in the South Bay, another great market because it's near the ports. And then there's communities like the City of Commerce, Vernon, LA, around a major city. Those are the 3 biggest Southern California markets: the South Bay, Inland Empire, LA market. All of those markets have over 300 million square feet of industrial buildings.
Amazing. Yeah, I saw there's an Amazon off the 15 freeway building that's just enormous.
They have 2 adjacent buildings totaling 2 million square feet.
My goodness. How would you value an industrial building? What items do you look at besides the ones that you mentioned? What else is important?
So I think in valuing any property, residential, industrial, the first thing is location, because location is going to dictate the value of the land under that building. Picture a building in Irvine, California, beautiful community on the 405 freeway. That land value is $100 a square foot plus. Now, if you take another community, let's use another industrial community in Orange County, the city of Stanton. It's an inland community. It doesn't have the cachet of an Irvine. That land may be worth 60% of what the Irvine land is. So one, I look at the general location. Then I look at the specific location. You take the property in Irvine, that general location, Irvine, is excellent. But as I mentioned, it could be on the 405 freeway, or it could be in an older section of Irvine that was developed back in the late 60s, early 70s. The buildings are older, the neighborhood's not as pristine. So first I look at location. Then I look at some of the amenities we've talked about before. Clear height, truck turning radius, sprinkler system, sophistication of it, amount of office space, the condition and age of the building, and the office. So at the high end, you're going to have a freeway frontage, marquee city, modern building that has all the amenities that a user would want. And at the other end, you could have an industrial building built in the 1950s out of brick, not concrete, that's older, low clearance, and poor loading. So you look at the location, immediate and general, you look at the amenities to the building, and you look at the age, and you can come up with a value of price per square foot is how they value an industrial building. So today, most industrial buildings sell for around $300 a square foot. If you had a 100,000 square foot industrial building, just generally speaking, it's worth $30 million. At the high end, brand new, maybe $500, $50 million. Okay. At the peak of the market, let's say in 2020, second generation 1980 construction, not state of the art, but very functional buildings were selling for as much as $400 a square foot. To kind of blend some of these topics we're discussing, Darryl, $400 a square foot in 2020, that same building would be in the $325 range today. So thus the devaluation of industrial buildings, primarily due to interest rates, in my opinion, primarily due to that.
Are there any modern technologies that will increase the value of industrial buildings that exist?
Well, the industrial building is kind of a simple box. So what technology have I seen over the years that has enhanced value? One is, let's back up to the 1970s. Many of the buildings were concrete block or red brick, and their clear height was, let's say, around 18 feet high inside the warehouse for stacking capability. And then, now we're going back to the 70s, so 45, 50 years ago, then there were concrete tilt-up buildings being built. And they call it concrete tilt-up because they pour the form of the walls on the ground, and then they get a crane to lift the wall, tilt the wall up to put the walls in place, like a toy box. So concrete tilt-up was the modernization of the industrial building, allowing you to pour and build a larger wall without the intense labor to lay the bricks from 18 feet high to 24 foot high. So to answer your question, today there are 32-foot clear industrial buildings that are very commonplace. So one would be the height, and although the tilt-up concept is 50 years old plus, they're going higher and higher. The second thing would be the sophistication of sprinkler systems. Originally, they would have a building that had a sprinkler system. Then they had what you called calculated sprinkler systems that would rate how much water would flow into the building in the event of the fire. And now they have what they call ESFR, early suppression, fast release, very sophisticated sprinkler systems that pump more water into these buildings to make them safer, to reduce your cost of insurance. Inside of these buildings, I would say that the modernization, what are we seeing? They have picking systems, or let's say you have an auto parts company that has all their auto parts inside of a building. And instead of sending Michael Collins down aisle 7 to go pull out 10 bolts like you see at an Ace Hardware and come back to package it and ship it, you can hit a computer and say, our client Ace Hardware wants 10 products, and they'll have an automated machine go pick at high heights or low the product type, return it, bundle it, and boom, it gets shipped out. So that automation is very sophisticated.
Yeah, robotics. That's
yes.
Increase the value. Now, you mentioned insurance. In the residential market, insurance has become quite challenging, frankly. How has it affected the commercial market?
So in California, the insurance rates for industrial buildings have gone up dramatically. Even in these tough times where lease rates have gone down and building values have gone down a bit, the insurance companies have been raising and raising rates. Part of it is weather, earthquake risk that the insurance carrier cautiously foresees. The other element is that the building values have appreciated dramatically. I've talked about them going from $400 a square foot in 2024 as we speak, which is, I'm sorry, in 2022, they were up to $400 a square foot. Now they've fallen. But if you back up to, let's say, the year 2000, these buildings might have been selling for $100 a square foot. So they've gone up fourfold. So the insurance companies are kind of catching up on the replacement value of these properties and raising rates. And I know some very big insurance companies for industrial commercial properties are leaving California because they think the risk of earthquake, fire is greater here than some other parts of the country. Okay, what's the solution there? Many of my clients that own multiple buildings have said to me, well, even though I bundle 12 properties, instead of insuring each one individually, I bundle them, I get a lower rate because I'm a better customer. The rates are still going up where it's very difficult. So it affects their net income. If they're leasing their building for $10,000 a month, and then they pay property insurance, and they were paying insurance of $500 a month, and now it's tripled to $1,500, those costs out of that $10,000 in my example reduce their net income, which is challenging. So one of the things I've learned in the last year is in an effort to help one of my clients, said, let me see what I can do about your interest or your insurance costs on your buildings. I found an insurance carrier that not only bundled for a particular client, but they would put in place a policy for, let's say, 5,000 buildings. And you as an individual could put your 10 buildings into that pool and pay your prorated share of the premium based on some variables, square footage, age of buildings. And I introduced one of my clients, high net worth individual, to this process. And he said it was dramatically less than any other quote that he received. And now many of his buildings are insured under this, let's call it pool concept.
What are some of the most common mistakes for commercial property investors?
Well, I'm glad you said the word investors, because the user who's going to lease or buy a building, he is very alert to what is important to operate his business. That keeps him keyed on, as we discussed before, trucking, or maybe in the case of a manufacturer, the power in an industrial building. Is it 200 amps, 400 amps, or 2,000 amps to operate his machine business? And also, many times we talk about industrial buildings, they're better with more dock high loading. A manufacturer, he may be more interested in grade level loading to bring in his steel product that he drives on a flatbed truck right into the building and then takes it off the truck with a forklift versus having a dock high building. So the user generally knows more of what he wants and what's important. By the way, in that latter case where I'm talking about a manufacturer, he may not be that interested in clear height if he has a heavy product and he's only going to stack it one item high, 10 feet, rolled up steel. So he may benefit by leasing a building that's sort of antiquated for a majority of these distribution users because it has low clear and maybe not so many truck high docks, but it's got some grade level. Now, I mentioned that as an example to show you how there can be some diverse components to a building. So what mistakes would I say the investors make? I try not to let them make any, because I want to help and guide them so they don't make a mistake. And I've found over the years that oftentimes when a client of mine says, well, I really like this building, and maybe it's not even a building I sold him, he's calling me to get my input on it. And I'll say, before I give you my feedback, I want to drive and physically look at the building, because I'm looking for the neighborhood. I'm looking for things I can see with my eyes, the size of the yard, the truck turning, age of the building, the clear height. By looking at it, I might not be able to tell if it's 26 or 24 foot clear, but I can tell if it's 18 foot clear or 30 foot clear, if it's functional, etc. And I am also looking at the use in the building, because industrial properties have to go through the scrutiny of environmental inspections, because a lender isn't going to make a loan on an industrial building that had a heavy manufacturer in it for 20 years that was, let's say, manufacturing chrome bumpers. And through that, the metal shavings or the oil that they use to run and cool their machines cause liquid to flow into the concrete floor and then into the ground. So I don't want to get too detailed, but the use would be important to me, not just the credit of the user. Oh, I've got this major manufacturing company and they have a net worth of $100 million and there's a high return. I'm going to buy the building, and I'll then counsel him by observing their use, heavy manufacturing, drill presses in the building. I'd like you to do an environmental study on the property and see its condition. Okay, where I really want to go with this is investors tend to look at yield above anything. 5% is better than 4%. My opinion, not necessarily. Generally, yes, but not necessarily. I want to look at the term of the lease. Maybe a transaction has a 4% return and will be rejected initially by my investor because he said, I don't want to buy anything less than a 5% return. But what if there's only a year to go on the lease and he's paying well under market rent, and you get a 4% return initially, and in 12 months you go to market, release it, and the rent goes up 60%. And that yield jumps from 4% to 6.5% in a year. That's a lot better than the 5% that might jump to 5.15% in a year. So what is the fairness of the rent being paid to deliver this return? And to the contrary, let's say that 6% yield that captures the attention of the investor. What if it's a sale leaseback where you and I own a book company and we own our building and we warehouse and distribute our books, and we go to the marketplace through our broker and say, we're going to lease this building back at $2 a square foot that's worth $1.50 a square foot. We inflate the rent to enable us to offer a compelling return. Somebody buys our building, but they're really overpaying because the rent in contract is inflated. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It requires a lot of evaluation.
Too much reliance on yield, where to me there should be more reliance on all the factors that would lead me to say, what's a fair return? How much is the price per square foot of the building? 400, 300. What's a better value? Well, if the 400 is for a new, modern, beautiful building, maybe it is the best value. But a very functional building at $300 a foot would capture, or $275 a foot would capture my attention today. And then I'm going to look at the condition of the building, the quality of the tenant. A tenant that's been in business for 50 years, that has a net worth of $20 million, may be as reliable as of a tenant as Home Depot, but you're going to pay dearly for the Home Depot. The cachet of the name. I've sold many investments to people where the tenant was a good, strong tenant with longevity, good liquidity, cash in bank, good net worth, things that I look at, but they're not a superstar company. But they're going to pay their rent on time in all probability, and you get a higher yield with that party. So for me to close, I evaluate, let's say, a dozen things to say out of 50 properties that I may evaluate, that I like these three the best because of those components I evaluate: location, age of the building, credibility of the tenant, use of the tenant, warehousing Kleenex boxes versus manufacturing racing wheels, custom wheels with lathes and metal shavings. So many things affect when I go to my client and say, I recommend this, and here's why.
Walk us through a purchase. You had mentioned inspections, environmental studies, et cetera. So let's say we find that building, a buyer wants to go ahead and enter into a purchase agreement. What happens next?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the first step after identification is negotiate the deal. Price, down payment, is there a loan, a due diligence period to secure and fund the loan, like residential, a due diligence period to inspect the roof, an expensive component of an industrial building, inspect the plumbing, the HVAC, pretty normal things, but they can have, depending on the size of the building, some pretty dramatic, perhaps unexpected costs. A 100,000-foot building that I said earlier might be worth $30 million. If the roof is shot, that 100,000 square foot roof replacement could cost $500,000. That's going to affect the buyer's return. So the other thing that's unusual relative to residential is environmental. Every time an industrial building is sold, there should be an environmental study conducted by an engineer, which is called a phase one. Without getting too detailed, basically they evaluate the surrounding neighborhood. If next door, Northrop occupied a building and in manufacturing airplane wings, heavy manufacturing, lots of solvents, oils, they could have contaminated the soil below their building, which could have migrated under the subject building. So that's an alert. If a neighbor, a door away, a block away of significance, it's known created environmental issues. Environmental contamination is primarily either in the soil or worse, in the groundwater. So you inspect that based on the general neighborhood and also the specific building. The engineer will look at historical occupants and what were their uses. So you go through these studies, you evaluate, and at that point in time, you may fairly renegotiate a bit because of your findings, or you may withdraw. I've had some multi-million-dollar escrows open with big REITs, real estate investment trusts. We did phase one and found contamination greater than either the seller was aware of or he disclosed, and we withdrew. So if you get through the inspection period, then you proceed to the closing. If there's a lender involved, which often with high net worth individuals, they may put 50% down and get a 50% loan. Relatively easy to obtain because they're putting so much equity down. That's kind of commonplace in an industrial investor versus high leverage where he's putting 10, 20% down. Some users may do that, but the investors typically are all cash, 50% down. That would be the most common. There's a lender involved. That lender is going to be a safeguard for you, the buyer, because he will demand the environmental study and he will scrutinize it. And the bank, the lender, they're more conservative than some of my buyers have been. I've sold properties to investors where there was some moderate contamination. Then you get it quantified. How could we remediate? How long would it take? What would the cost be? And where you want to end up with this is to get what they call an NFA from governmental agencies that mean no further action. We sign off that that property is not earmarked as a property that needs remediation. I've had investors buy those kind of properties, but again, that's all part of the mix of risk. And the seller may have found, I can't find a buyer for my property because it's got this stigma. So he'll reduce the price to a level where somebody will be compelled to buy it. Quick example. There was a property that was on the market for approximately $20 million, industrial, occupied, 2 buildings, 2 tenants, and the seller could not sell it at $20 million because he had an environmental issue, and just the red flag of environmental caused the buyers to withdraw. I produced a buyer and said, let's go quantify what it will cost to remediate the site. And then let's try to buy it for substantially less than that cost because of having a contingency that you may expend some hundreds of thousands of dollars. And they said, oh, by the way, we want you to do this and that. So what we did, very specific example, is we assumed that the remediation would be about $1 million. We disclosed that to the seller and said the remediation is going to be $1 million, but we're still buying a property with a stigma. And once we get into this, oh, by the way, the cost could be more and more. So we'll buy your property right now, close this month, all cash, no loan, because no lender is going to loan on your property. We want a $3 million discount. We know we're going to spend $1 million, and maybe it'll become $2 million, but we'll take the risk. We closed the escrow, $17 million all cash. Seller was happy because he couldn't sell his contaminated property. My buyer was happy at the time of closing. That story's 3 years old. I talked to him about a month ago and said, how did the remediation work out for costs, and do we have a nice get? He said, very well. We did the remediation inside the $1 million budget.